Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're diving into game engines, specifically Unity and Godot. We got a bunch of articles comparing the two, so let's see what we can learn.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison because we're looking at two pretty different philosophies on game development.
Okay, so like for those of us who aren't, coding whizzes,
Mhm.
what exactly are Unity and Godot? I mean, I know they're game engines, but what does that even mean?
Basically, a game engine is like a big toolbox that's pre-packed with a bunch of code and tools that help you build video games. So like graphics, physics simulations, audio, even networking, so you don't have to start from scratch.
So it's like having the foundation of a house already built, and then you get to come in and design the interior and make it your own.
Exactly. Now, Unity is like that really popular home building company everyone knows. They've been around since 2005, known for being really versatile. You can build for, I think, pretty much any platform. Phones, computers, consoles, VR, you name it. Unity can probably handle it.
Wow, that's super impressive. What about Godot? How does it fit into the picture?
Godot is like that up-and-coming independent contractor who everyone's starting to talk about.
Uh-huh.
Released in 2014, so quite a bit younger than Unity. But what's interesting is that it's completely open source.
Okay, hold on. Back up for a sec. Open source. For those of us who don't know what that means, can you explain it and why should we care?
Sure. Open source basically means that the code of the software, in this case the Godot engine, is totally free. Anyone can download it, look at it, change it up, even share their own version of it. It's all completely legal and actually encouraged.
So it's like if you had a recipe for, I don't know, some amazing cookies and you just shared it with the world, anyone could take that recipe, make their own tweaks, and share their variations, right?
Perfect analogy. And that's what makes it really different. Godot is totally free to use, even for commercial projects. That's huge, especially for indie developers who are starting out and don't have a ton of money to spend.
Makes sense. So we've got Unity, kind of the big versatile giant, and then Godot, the scrappy newcomer with this open source approach. And one thing that really jumped out to me from the articles is the cost. Godot being totally free has got to be a huge plus for indie devs or students, right?
Yeah.
But Unity has a free version too.
It does, yeah, and that's where it gets confusing. Unity uses, it's kind of like a freemium model, Their
Uh-huh.
basic version is free, even commercially, as long as your game doesn't make more than a certain amount.
So there's a catch. What happens if, like, your game blows up and you're rolling in dough?
That's when you'd need to upgrade to one of their paid plans, which can get really expensive depending on, your revenue and what features you need. But yeah, definitely something to keep in mind.
Gotcha. So let's say I'm brand new to this whole game development thing. Don't know a ton about coding? Which engine would be easier to learn? Godot, being open source, or Unity with its free version?
This is where things get interesting. They both have a learning curve, but they approach it differently. Godot is known for being incredibly beginner-friendly, and a lot of that is because of its visual, node-based system.
Node-based, you're going to have to break that down for me.
So imagine you're building a puzzle. Each piece is like a different action or function in your game, and you connect them all visually to create the logic. It's really intuitive, especially for visual learners.
So instead of like actually writing out code, you're dragging and dropping blocks of functionality.
Yeah.
That actually sounds a lot less scary.
Exactly. And on top of that, Godot uses its own scripting language called GDScript, which is really easy to learn, even for people who've never coded before. Think of it as a simplified way of programming.
So Godot's like the engine that holds your hand a little as you're figuring things out. What about Unity?
Unity also has a visual editor, but its main language is C#.
C#, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. It's used a lot in software development, super powerful and versatile, but can be harder to learn for beginners. So Unity gives you that power with C#, and Godot has that streamlined, beginner-friendly experience with the GDScript and visual tools.
So more power under the hood versus a smoother ride out of the gate.
Yeah, pretty much. And it comes down to your experience and comfort level. If you're totally new, Godot's a good starting point. But if you know C# or want to really dive into a more robust language, then Unity might be a better fit. And the interesting thing is, even if you start with one, you could always switch later. A lot of the concepts, they carry over.
Good to know. It's not a lifelong commitment.
Yeah.
Speaking of different approaches, graphics, I mean, that's got to be huge in game dev.
It really is. The visuals can make or break a game. And this is another area where Unity and Godot, they've gone in different directions. Unity, it's known for being powerful, really versatile with graphics. It's the engine behind some of the most visually stunning games, those big budget ones, crazy realistic.
So if you want photorealism, like those hyper-realistic characters,
Mm.
amazing landscapes.
Yeah.
That's where Unity shines.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of that is Unity's rendering pipeline, basically how it takes those 3D models, textures, lighting, all that, and turns it into the final images you see. And Unity gives you a ton of control over that. Good for experienced devs who really want to squeeze out every bit of performance.
So Unity's graphics are like driving a high-performance sports car. You need to know what you're doing, right?
I like that. Godot's traditionally been known for its 2D graphics, though.
2D, so think like classic side-scrollers or those retro pixel art games.
Exactly. Their 2D rendering engine is super efficient, but that doesn't mean it can't handle 3D. Godot's made big improvements, especially with Godot 4, their latest version. Their focus has just traditionally been more on making 2D development really smooth.
So for indie devs starting smaller, especially in 2D, Godot's a good fit.
Definitely. And even if they do go 3D later on, Godot 4 is more than capable. Might not have all the bells and whistles of Unity, but it's great, especially for people who want ease of use.
This is making a lot of sense. Okay, so say I'm sold on this whole game dev thing, feeling inspired. But then I hit a wall. I need something specific, like a giant spider enemy or an epic castle, but I have no idea how to make it. What do I do?
That's where assets come in.
Assets.
Think of them like pre-made parts for your game. Anything from 3D models, characters, environments, textures, sound effects, music, even pre-written code for game mechanics.
So instead of spending months making every little thing myself, I can just grab these pre-made assets. What a time saver.
Yeah, both Unity and Godot have their own way of handling this. Unity has its asset store.
Ah, yes. The asset store. I've heard tales. What's it like?
It's huge, a giant online marketplace. Developers buy and sell assets for Unity. Characters, props, whole game templates, everything.
So it's a one-stop shop, but also potentially super overwhelming.
It can be. So much to choose from, but for a lot of developers, especially those on tight deadlines, the Unity Asset Store is a lifesaver.
Makes sense. It's like grocery shopping with a list versus just wandering around lost.
Yeah.
So what about Godot? Do they have something like that?
They do. The Godot Asset Library, it's smaller than Unity's for sure, but it's growing all the time. Plus, remember, Godot's open source.
Right. Share the recipe.
Exactly. That applies to assets too. You'll find tons of free open source Godot assets all over the place. Forums, websites, people sharing their work.
That's amazing. So it's not as centralized, but Godot makes up for it with that whole community spirit.
Exactly. A lot of developers love that about Godot. It's not just using the engine, it's being part of that community.
It's really cool, that community aspect, that shared ownership speaks to a different philosophy.
It does. And it makes you think about how these philosophies, Unity being more commercial and Godot being open source, how they actually play out, in the real world.
Also,
Well, with Unity's asset store, as convenient as it is, it can, sometimes make developers think plug and play. They might just grab something pre-made instead of learning how to build it themselves.
so instead of learning, say, how to make a realistic physics system, they just download one.
Right. And that's fine for speed, but they might miss out on learning those deeper skills. Whereas Godot, with that open source approach, that sharing, it encourages people to tinker, to really figure out how things work at a base level.
So less about shortcuts, more about empowering creators.
Totally. Not saying pre-made assets are bad, there's a time and place.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how the tools themselves can kind of nudge us in certain directions, creatively. Unity towards efficiency, Godot towards more experimentation.
Such a good point. Even when we want to be efficient, sometimes it pays to take that time to really understand our tools,
Absolutely. That's often where the breakthroughs happen, when you go beyond the pre-packaged solutions.
Love that. So we've talked a lot about where Unity and Godot are now. What about the future? Any predictions?
That's the big question. Both are always evolving. Unity, they seem to be going beyond games even, architecture, film, automotive, anything with that real-time 3D stuff.
So the tech that makes amazing game graphics could also be used to design buildings or do special effects.
Yeah. They're getting into XR big time too, VR, AR, all that, blending the digital and physical.
Wow, that's next level.
Yeah.
What about Godot? What does the future hold for them?
Looking bright. Godot 4 was huge for them, for 3D, and that community keeps pushing things forward. One thing I'm keeping an eye on is the blockchain stuff.
Blockchain, like cryptocurrency, NFTs, that blockchain.
That's the one. Early days, but imagine players really owning their game assets. Godot, being open and flexible, could be huge there.
So cool. Sounds like both Unity and Godot have huge potential, not just for games, but for how we experience, well, everything.
For sure.
As we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I'd say there's never been a better time to make games. Unity, Godot, whatever you choose, the most important thing is to just start creating.
Perfectly said. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us today. And listeners, keep those creative sparks flying. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.